Probably the one I enjoyed most and certainly felt most privileged to do was Louis Sussman, who was the American ambassador to London. I interviewed him at the Daily Telegraph building in Victoria, in the theatre is the best way to describe it. Towards the end of his time as ambassador, he's a lawyer, or was a lawyer, he was an investment banker, and Barack Obama made him ambassador to London, which for all countries is the top job, the number one coming to London. The Americans might try to argue, but of course when they're coming here they can't argue because not even the Americans can be an ambassador to their own country. It was a double session in that there were about 130 people, all personally invited, and he spoke on the record, and it was a great speech. And I had nothing to do with that, just introduced him and off he went. Then we had a question and answer session, which was off the record, which was very good. He was exceptionally frank. But when we were doing sound tests early, I said to him, is there anything you want me to steer clear of in the questions, despite the fact it's off the record? This was not a smart-ass, clever interview. This was, informative. And he said, no. I said, is there anything you ever wanted to do? He said, I've always wanted to say no comment. So I thought, well, okay. And while he was speaking, I remembered, and I perhaps tend to do this, that I'd had a nice, large fillet steak and a glass of red wine before we went to the event. That gets me. Dennis Compton used to take a double gin before he went to bat. Churchill would drink a glass of champagne or something. So, nice fillet steak and a glass of red wine. And I was reading the Evening Standard, and I read in it, and this interview took place in November, that Michelle Obama had got an advance copy of Downton Abbey before it was out. And in our chat at some point, he'd said that they were going back to Washington for Christmas and they'd almost certainly be invited to the White House. And we presented his wife with a bunch of flowers. She was sitting in the front row. And I said, well, Ambassador, you've been really fantastic. I greatly appreciate your time and your openness. But I'd just like to ask you one final question that's a little lighter than some of the things we've discussed. If, when you're back, you're invited to the White House, and if you're invited, because I've learned Michelle Obama's got this advance copy, to watch the advance copy of Downton Abbey, will you? And he looked straight at me and said, no comment. The two of us were in hysterics on the stage, the audience scratching their head, wondering what this means and why it's so funny, and his wife is jumping up and down saying yes. But to interview somebody of that worldliness, that knowledge, that experience, and for him to be as open as he was, okay, off the record, but didn't have to be as open as he was a great privilege, and I loved it. Another person I thoroughly enjoyed interviewing, and again felt privileged, was Frederick Forsyth, Freddie. One of the great writers of the latter part of the 20th century, 21st century, who, and he must be nearly 80 now. I think he was 78 when I interviewed him 2 autumns ago, so he probably is 80. A man of hugely worldly experience. And he's given up writing. His wife began to get worried for him because he goes out and researches. His first book, The Day of the Jackal, was written as a result of being a reporter in France during the student riots and the OAS and so on. He doesn't check his facts, he investigates them, and he gets it absolutely right. When I interviewed him, he was campaigning for Sergeant Blackman, who was a British serving officer in Iraq, who was court-martialed for killing an Iraqi when he shouldn't have done, it was said. It's fair to say there was a fair amount of doubt around the whole thing, and Forsyth was blunt that Blackman was being used as a scapegoat for the British forces, and he wasn't having any of it, and he had his full support and was going to do everything he could to assist the guy in getting pardoned. And I said, you've just said a scapegoat for the British Army. We're being filmed. And he looked at the camera and said, yeah, he's been made a scapegoat for the British Army. Sergeant Blackman's conviction was later quashed, but he spent 3.5 years, I think, in prison out of the 10 years that he was sentenced to. But Forsyth struck me as a man of great integrity. We have spoken in other contexts during interviews at other times about structure and discipline. And there's a man, it applies to everything. There's a man with it in his books. He gets the facts right and he consistently writes good stories. Not necessarily the most entertaining. We had what I'd call almost sophisticated jokes and banter, but no flippancy, but great guy and a privilege to interview him. I interviewed Ken Clarke in the summer of 2018, so of course post the Brexit referendum and post a lot of the debates in Parliament, but pre the actual final legislation. Ken Clarke, I once kept waiting 45 minutes in a pub, which was back in 1987, probably 86, something like that. He didn't hold it against me at all. Another 3/4 hour in a pub meant another pint. He was very happy. A real big beast of post-war British politics, or latter half of the 20th century British politics. Probably the best Prime Minister the Tory party never had. He was very open, he was very genuine, he was very relaxed, and in fact, it wasn't really an interview. He is 10 years-ish, 8 years older than me. I've always had an interest in politics, I've been involved, I've stood for Parliament, and he was helping me out when I kept him waiting in a pub. It was really like two guys just chatting about the last 50 years in British politics. One who had a very good second-hand knowledge and detail, another who had a brilliant first-hand knowledge and had been involved in chunks of it. It was a phenomenal interview. The only trouble, and I've not seen the playback of the film, strangely enough, the only trouble is that we were at Devonshire Terrace, which is in Devonshire Square, which is in Devonshire Terrace, which is a restaurant near Liverpool Street. And that day, there was a street band playing in the square, and the street band started playing just as we started recording the interview. So it's got background music. I've not heard what difference that made. But it was a wonderful opportunity to reminisce, I suppose, with one of the big beasts of the last 40 years of British politics. He was in Margaret Thatcher's government, he was Chancellor, and when Tony Blair came to power, part of Gordon Brown's commitment prior to the election was that he would stick for the first 2 years to Ken Clarke, his predecessor in the Chancellery, Ken Clarke's spending plans. So a man of great significance in British politics. And a lovely guy. I'm not sure I got off, I say this a bit tongue-in-cheek, on the right foot with him though when I interviewed him, because I said, Ken, I understand that a more modern British politician has largely modelled himself on you. And Ken is genuinely a man of the people, because he wanted to be a man of the people. He smokes cigars and he drinks beer. But because he never quite made it, because he forgot to wear the hush puppies. And he said, what? I said, his name's Farage. But when he went to Dulwich College School, at 13 I guess, of course, he was Farage, because in South London, a garage is a garage. And when he left school, he'd become Farage. And I heard that from at Lionel Barber's Lifetime Award dinner, who of course Lionel is editor of the Financial Times, who was also at Dulwich College at the same time. My very first London Grill Club guest was Mike Gatting, former England captain. Had a run-in with a Sri Lankan umpire at one point in his career, and of course was the victim to that unbelievable wicket ball that Shane Warne bowled around his legs, and that's made Gat famous for that. But as people know, outside work, which is my real passion in life, My interests are politics, current affairs and cricket. And although I'll be 70 next season, I'm still playing and I intend to play for a lot longer. But I was at a function at Lord's and Gat was standing around in a group of people and I'm known as Grandad Cricket. And I walked up and said hi to this group and they all said hi. And I said, Gat, I want to offer you a free lunch. Everybody fell about laughing. He's known for his love of food and the odd glass of wine. And he said, what do I have to do? I said, you have to turn up, talk to me, eat and drink. When? And he was the first guest. It was the prototype. And it was good, and I hadn't thought of him, but I'd thought of the idea before. It was good because it was somebody I knew, somebody I'm comfortable with, a subject I'm comfortable with, where it is just going to be a very pleasant little chat. So it worked incredibly well. And the last question I put to Gat was, apart from Lord's, of course, which cricket ground in the world sells the best pies? He replied instantly, Old Trafford. In early 2018, I interviewed Vince Cable, Sir Vince Cable, who was then leader of the Liberal Democrats. He did say in that interview that he intended to fight the next election, although he was 75 when I interviewed him, and not just fight it, but lead the Liberal Democrats. It wasn't many months after he retracted on that. If I go back and look at that footage, I can find him giving a commitment we can haunt him with. But he's part of a dying breed. Okay, he was an economist and they're all theoretical and unpractical, but he had worked for governments and he'd worked for Shell. He had been in the real world in which the rest of us live before going into politics. All too much today, top politicians seem to be career politicians, but he definitely is not a career politician. And he had the very difficult job of structuring, negotiating the coalition agreement in 2010 between the Tories and the Liberals, and that resulted in him being in the Department of Trade and Industry, or whatever it's called, every government gives it a different name, in the DTI for 5 years. And he did a good job, no question of that. But it was a special for me in that it was the first time I'd interviewed a serving, sitting party political leader. Now I don't count Farage because although he was leader of UKIP, he was an MEP, but he wasn't in the British Parliament. So it was as special as a first. And we again, and it was a bit like the interview with Ken Clarke, we covered a lot of ground which you really have to understand of the last 30 or 40 years in order to interpret the current situation and to try to make any sense of it and come up with answers. On my Radio Faversham programme, Faversham Natters, I interviewed a most charming and unassuming lady called Jenny Gurney. She has been responsible for arranging the funding and setting up, I think it's now 5 homes for people with disabilities. The reason, and they're not in Faversham, but the reason I asked her to be a guest was a few years ago she set up something called Finvola in Faversham, which was for older people with disabilities. And Finvola is actually Hugh Grant's mother's name. And he is a patron and he helps them raise money. Has been wandering the streets of Faversham singing, and he's going to Finvola. But the most incredible and unassuming lady, she doesn't on her LinkedIn page have her picture. I don't think she has it on Facebook. And she just quietly gets on with delivering something good in the community. It was a very moving discussion and just showed what a great country we can be as people when it comes to helping others and putting things together. A lady who just quietly achieves, and for which a lot of people are very grateful.